Another handful of people coming in. All right, I think that's everyone. As people show up, we'll admit them, but we don't want to punish the punctual.
Can
So,
I update the group with one thing, Eileen?
yes.
The Mets got eliminated from the playoffs. If you are a Mets fan, I just wanted to remind you that we stink and we are out of the playoffs again. Terrible. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, today's the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, so
There we go.
that's a better announcement. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for taking the time yet again to spend with us to talk about forestry issues. We certainly appreciate it. Today's meeting, we are going to focus on or present the results of that survey on the framework. I'll let you know where as a task force people stand. The co-chairs got together, took a look at the comments that were in the survey, and we made some revisions based on those comments. Now, it was a little bit tricky because a lot of folks said, we agree. So we might have made a revision to something you said you agreed with. So we were very mindful of making sure that revisions further clarified or brought people who might have been on the fence more towards supporting the framework without losing the people who already agreed with the framework. So we'll be spending a lot of time presenting those revisions. After we've presented them all, just like last time, we will take clarifying questions. This is the first time you're seeing the revisions, so we want to give you enough time to process, ask your questions for clarifications, and then we'll take a poll to see, based on the revisions, those of you that were maybe in the middle, will you tend to more agree with what we've done now or not? And then we'll have some discussion. So that's what we hope to accomplish throughout the meeting. Did I miss anything, anyone? Co-chairs? No, because I'll go right into the survey results. All righty. Okay, so let me grab my statistics. Oh, one more thing. As we go along, some people prefer to put their questions in the chat rather than raise their hand, and that is fine. Be sure to direct any questions, though, to Allison Schmeider. She is going to share those questions with the other co-chairs so that we can get to them. So Allison is also going to share the screen. For those of you that joined us in September, it's the same process. We're going to share the screen, go through these bullets and revisions as we go. So the first thing that you should see on the screen, Ali, do you have that up, are the results of the overall framework. So you'll see about 124 people responded to the survey. 30, these are approximate numbers, you know, it's a rough count. About 32% agreed, supported the framework as a whole. 34% said they were likely to agree with some revisions. 18% said they were not likely to agree unless there were some certain revisions made, and they provided some of those suggestions. And 16% disagreed outright with the entire framework. Now, I don't have the percentages here, but I will tell you the percentages of the two components of the framework. Again, this is the entire framework. The similar percentages for the planning and inventory component, interestingly, 25% agreed, 44% are likely to agree, 13% said not likely, and 14% disagreed. I'm going to give you those percentages again because I know a lot of you are interested in these and you might be writing these down. So again, the planning and inventory agree 25%, likely to agree 44%, not likely to agree without revision 13%, and disagree 14%. So that was the planning and inventory component. On the management and implementation, the percentages are for agree, 33%, likely to agree was 31%, not likely was 20%, and disagree 17%. So again, agree 33%, likely to agree 31%, not likely to agree 20%, and disagree 17%. So interestingly, well, I find this interesting, the pattern of agreement for the whole framework was kind of similar to the management and implementation. And then the planning and inventory, people had a lot to say. So you'll probably be seeing a lot of comments and possible revisions in that particular section. All right, what do I have next? Thank you, Allie. Okay, so now I'm going to segue into the actual bullet points. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tom Gilbert, to start us off.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. All right, so we're going to take these bullet by bullet, and what you can see in blue are, we have the original, and then we have the revised with the changes in blue. So you'll see that we made the change from inventories of all biota to significant biota as determined by the scientific advisory panel. And this is really, honestly, this is just sort of to be realistic and practical. And these were comments that some people raised, you know, and so I think deferring to the scientific advisory panel to provide some guidance on what the priority inventories are was sort of a nod to sort of just the practicality of all of this. The only other change is that we realized that the original bullet it just says New Jersey's public forests, so it wasn't clear whether we were talking about state, county, municipal, even nonprofit lands conserved with state funding. So we wanted to clarify that, and again, also just to be sort of realistic, even just the notion of comprehensive inventory and planning across all the state lands is an enormous undertaking in and of itself. So we thought that the initial inventory and planning process should focus on state-owned lands and then be extended to county, municipal, and other lands. So those are the changes to bullet number 1.
Yeah, I just have one thing to add, Tom. You'll see that there's an asterisk by Science Advisory Panel. Throughout this process, a lot of people ask for definitions, and we're going to provide definitions. For this, there are 3 areas where you'll see the asterisks where we say below what we mean by that. So we define who the Science Advisory Panel is. We'll get to that. It's at the very bottom. But basically, it's a panel of experts. We do define that. But in general, for those of you who really who specifically said define this term, define that term, we are going to have a glossary of terms attached as an addendum to the framework.
Thanks, Eileen. Yeah, good clarification. All right, so let's go to 2. We want to go through all of these so you can see the full picture before we kind of open it up. Okay, so a couple of changes here to the notion of a formal rulemaking process to guide the development of forest management plans. So the first change is that we added some language to be a little more specific when we're talking about forest management plans. That includes both forest stewardship plans and ecological restoration plans. Again, those are comments that were made and proposals that were submitted, you know, emphasized, you know, some of those differences and the importance of being inclusive there in terms of the different types of forest management plans that are possible and appropriate. And then the other change is to note that the rulemaking process should be done in parallel with the inventory and planning process. And, recognizing that inventory and planning process is going to take a significant amount of time. And there were, comments raised about, well, how long is all this going to take? And, sort of what happens in the meantime, and or concerns about sort of nothing really changing in the meantime while this lengthy process is carried out. One response to that is to have the rulemaking process be conducted in parallel with the inventory and planning and process, but ultimately it has to be informed by that inventory and planning process as well. Does any of my co-chairs want to add anything to those changes? Okay, keep going. Okay, so 3 and 4. Originally, 3 and 4 were about, 3 was about expansion of natural areas, and 4 was about creating a new designation for ecological reserves. We've combined the 3 and 4 into the new 4, as you'll see in a moment, consolidated the discussion of natural areas and ecological reserves. But we've added a new bullet. So bullet 3 here is completely new. And this gets at further some of those same issues that I was just discussing related to the concerns we heard about the length, the lengthy process that, obviously is going to be entailed here as far as an inventory and planning process, and concerns about what happens in the interim. And so in addition to saying the ultimate rulemaking process should be conducted in parallel with the inventory and planning process, we've added a new concept here that there should be a separate rulemaking process that happens right away. And by right away, we mean within 12 months of whenever, and again, this would require, I think, legislative action, unless the DEP, would sort of take this on in the absence of that. But a rulemaking process should happen right away within 12 months. So we need to have a more formal, clear process governing the review of forest management plans, even while this lengthier inventory and planning and ultimate rulemaking process is carried out. We are recommending that the existing New Jersey DEP 14-step stakeholder process, which is an internal process that's in place right now and utilized for DEP review and public input on forest management plans, that be the starting point, right? It's already in place. We're not necessarily suggesting that it be adopted by rule, exactly verbatim as is, but it should be the starting place for a rulemaking process, and there could be stakeholdering around that and input sought from the public and stakeholders around, are there any modifications to that 14-step process that should be considered? But ultimately, something akin to the 14-step process should be adopted through rules within a year, right? So that we do have a within relatively short order, right? We have a formal process for reviewing forest management plans, and then we discuss, well, what happens even in that 1 year period, right? What happens in that interim period? And we are recommending that no newly initiated plans be approved during that 1 year time frame, with some exceptions if there are management activities that are necessary for fire management or to respond to emergency scenarios like some kind of natural disaster or significant pest or disease outbreak. There should be exceptions that don't tie the hands of the DEP to deal with kind of urgent actions needed. That any new modifications to an approved plan in the interim would be subject to the current 14-step process as well while the rulemaking is being completed. So this is a very significant change from the last framework that you all saw to really put in place, we believe, some timely, right? Some measures that are going to happen, not just within a year that there be rulemaking, but even then some parameters around how things are dealt with and considered in that interim 1-year period. So let me stop there and see if any of my co-chairs want to add anything to that. Okay, thumbs up. All right, so last one for me, and then I'm going to turn it over to others. So the new number 4, which is the combination of the previous 3 and 4, the separate bullets about natural areas and ecological reserves. So we've consolidated this to focus on basically the issue of set-asides. What we're talking about here are set-asides. There are different ways that could work. So we've said there should be, the planning process should identify areas to be set aside through designations that could include ecological reserves and or protected natural areas as they're currently defined by the Natural Areas Program that's established in state statute. And, within those set-asides, there's only management as necessary to address ecological threats and as determined by an oversight council. And that's really the way the Natural Areas Program works right now, right? And importantly here, a primary goal for these areas is to promote growth of maturing forests and to provide for future old growth forests for their carbon and their other ecological benefits. And again, we've certainly heard, a lot of concern and focus on the carbon, the importance of carbon and climate considerations, and the importance of maturing an old growth forest in that regard. And that's exactly what this recommendation is trying to get at. We also added that in planning for these set-asides, the national initiative to protect 30% of the land base by 2030, which is an initiative of the Biden administration, this should be considered in evaluating what percentage of public land should be designated. Now, we're not saying, exactly 30% of public land should be designated. That should be determined, that should come out of the planning process. It should be based on the science and the data and the planning. But we believe, just to provide kind of a frame of reference, that was useful to point to this national initiative that is focused on protecting 30% of the land base by 2030. And then lastly, again, we're leaving somewhat open the best mechanism to create these set-asides. We believe this needs further discussion. This could be accomplished through an overhaul and expansion of the current Natural Areas Program, or a new program and entity could be established for this purpose. So let me stop there and see what, that's a lot. These are probably the most significant changes, I think, to the framework here are embodied in 3 and 4. So anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add about the Natural Lands Program. A lot of people liked that program. They liked the idea of expanding it. So that doesn't go away with this revision. As you see in that last paragraph, we still do want, that still is a recommendation that can be one of the mechanisms or something else. So I just wanted, for those of you who did comment that you like that program, it's still here with this revision.
Yeah, thanks, Eileen. And that's because currently the Natural Areas Program, the focus of that is a little bit different, right? It's not really about protecting maturing forests and providing for future old growth forests with an emphasis on carbon and things like that, and so yeah, either that program could continue to exist with the current focus that it has, and a new program could be added which has more of this focus on maturing forests and old growth forests and carbon, or the Natural Areas Program could be expanded, right? The charge and the capacity of it, right? It's got to have the capacity to take this on as well. So, and I think similarly, Eileen, there's an asterisk on the Oversight Council, which we'll get to down below, but has similar language around that council needing to have kind of the appropriate, expertise, right, for the job. So. Okay, I think unless you all have anything else to add, I think we can move on to 5. Which is not me. I forget who's doing 5, but it's not me.
Sorry, it's number 5 we're on. I need
Yeah.
to pull it up. Here we go. Okay. So this one just has one small clarification. The planning process must identify areas where active management is needed to address current and future threats to ecological health, such as invasive species proliferation, or to address goals as identified in the planning process. So actually quite a few people asked for that to specifically mention invasive species in this particular bullet, and we saw no issue with that, so we included that. Co-chairs, anything else to add on this bullet? Okay, for number 6, the planning process must recognize the importance of adaptive management, whereby planning, inventory, and management approaches are adjusted. Originally, it wasn't clear that adaptive management applies not only to the management approaches, but to the planning and the inventory as well. So we further clarified that. That they are adjusted over time based upon new data and changing circumstances in our forests. We added a sentence: the statewide planning and inventory should be updated at least every 10 years after completion of the first statewide inventory. And we do recognize that doing these statewide inventories will be a time-intensive effort in the beginning. But because we felt that every 10 years, though, was a reasonable amount of time to update them, and that the updates should take a lesser amount of time than the original. Anything else to add, Tom, Andy, Anjali? Okay.
I think one quick thing. I think we picked 10 years because we believe that the State Forest Action Plan is updated every 10 years. But if anybody has other information on that, let us know. But we thought, and perhaps it could be done sort of in sync with that.
Right. And 7, we changed the wording a bit. There were a lot of folks that wondered about, the Pinelands, and it seemed to be very Pinelands focused without recognizing that forests are different on a much, much smaller level as well. So the new wording with the same thought is: one guiding principle of the planning process must be to consider the significant variation in our forests, both on a macro landscape level and micro level. For example, the uniqueness of the entire Pinelands ecosystem compared to other regions of the state should be acknowledged, as well as the variations that occur at a much finer spatial scale within a forest. So we felt that clarified what we meant by variation a little bit more. Anything to add? All right. And then I think for number 8, I am sending it to Anjali.
Yes, thank you, Eileen. Okay, so number 8, I'm going to start by saying that we got a lot of feedback saying, okay, but what climate goals? So similarly, as we were using this mechanism of endnotes to the framework in previous bullet points, we have added here 2 asterisks to reference the Global Warming Response Act, so like the climate goals that are in statute, as well as the Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 report that was created by the DEP that specifically talks about forestry, climate, carbon sequestration, and goals and numbers. And so we provide the link, and it's all addressed in the endnotes. So that's, the first change that you can see on bullet number 8. The second change, it was flagged to us that even low intensity and safe public recreation opportunities are too broad. For example, mountain biking is something that could be considered under low intensity recreation opportunities. And so, as you all know, that can be really aggressive with our forests because you do have to cut trees, and these trails are not, they're not trails that you can just use for hiking, right? You have to create these new trails that are specific design for mountain biking. So similarly, we're doing an end note with the 3 asterisks that essentially clearly states what do we mean by low intensity, safe public recreation opportunities, not including, anything with a motor, obviously, and things like mountain biking, which can be very aggressive. So planning inventories, well, let me just read the whole thing, right? Forest management, planning, and implementation. New Jersey's public forest land must be protected and managed to maintain and enhance carbon sequestration and storage as necessary to meet the state climate goals, while meeting equally important goals of ecological health, biological diversity, climate resiliency, and protection of water and soil resources, while providing low intensity, safe public recreation opportunities. Planning and inventories should guide the prioritization of management goals in specific areas, recognizing that these goals will be achieved across the aggregate of acres owned by the state rather than one single acre in any specific area. So to explain that is that we're not going to achieve all goals within one portion of a forest. One acre is the example that we're putting here, but that one set aside or one area that is being managed or whatever it is, that area should not be subject to all of the goals that we're trying to achieve on a statewide basis. That's what it clarifies. And then the last portion of the edits here is areas having historical, cultural, and spiritual significance for Indigenous people should be characterized and protected. We heard feedback regarding this, and we think it's incredibly important to include in our framework. And they definitely should be first identified and definitely protected. Okay, Allie, if you can scroll to number 9. So number 9, all forest management plans on public land must be developed in accordance with the process established through rulemaking noted in the previous section, bullet number 2. So this is to clarify, it's the big rulemaking. It's not the rulemaking that needs to be done within a year. And continuously guided by the statewide planning and inventory as it's developed. Because, in the previous bullets that Tom was explaining, we recognize the inventory and the planning is going to take a very long time. The rulemaking won't necessarily take, and we hope it won't take as long as the inventory and planning. So there needs to be this live feeding of information for rulemaking for plans. So this right here, this bullet number 9 is recognizing that the inventory and the planning should continuously always guide the information and the decision-making for the planning, for the management plans. And I'm sorry, I haven't asked my fellow co-chairs if you want to add anything on number 8 and number 9. So please go ahead, let me know.
No, not necessarily to add to those, but I think Allie is going to put the link to our document. Several people said they're more visual. You'd like to see them as we go through them. So I see no harm in that. Just don't go ahead. So she's going to provide the link, and that way you can scroll up, and take a look if you've forgotten some.
Thank you, Eileen. Tom?
Angela, I just had one thing.
Yeah.
I didn't look at this one closely enough. It seems to me that I think the plans would be in accordance with the rulemaking noted in both 2 and 3 above, because once that initial rulemaking is completed within a year, any forest management plan would have to comply with that. And then ultimately would also have to comply with the more comprehensive rulemaking that's completed. It's going to take more than a year.
That's a great flag. Thank you, Tom. So that time frame between after the year, but also right before the big rulemaking gets done.
I mean, as long as everyone agrees with that, I think that's probably what we intended there.
Yeah, I just made that change in the master copy, Tom, so we don't forget.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. That's a great flag, Tom. And I think I have number 10. Lucky me, number 10 was not changed. It stayed the same, so I'm just going to read it. Meeting these goals require multiple tools and approaches to be guided by sound science. There's some typos here we're going to correct. By sound science, as well as being consistent with and guided by the inventory and planning process. So that stayed the same. And Eileen, Andy, Tom, anything to be added here? Great. Okay, so next is Andy with bullets 11 through 14.
Okay, so my apologies in advance if I'm reading slow. My computer system just totally shut down and I'm now working off my phone. So the screen is much smaller, obviously. So this is bullet point number 11. Everybody can hear me loud and clear. Good. Yeah. Okay.
It's a
I'm
little
assuming
bit,
you can hear me. All right. Okay. So this was the bullet point about fire. Oh, am I better now?
You're good, Andy. We can hear you.
yeah.
I'm good.
We'll
Okay.
let you know
All right.
if we cannot hear you.
Sorry, the phone is yeah, it's a lot smaller. So this was the one about prescribed fire, and we were particularly talking about catastrophic fire in pine barrens, but we kind of wanted to flesh this out a little bit further. We got a lot of feedback on this. So the first sentence is not changing. I'll just read it. Prescribed burns are a necessary management tool to reduce the catastrophic fire risk in ecosystems like the pine barrens. Additionally, prescribed burns should be deployed in order to meet other critical ecological objectives throughout the state. The current rules related to burn plans and the use of fire should be revisited and revised in order to make this management tool one that can be more successfully utilized by the New Jersey Forest Fire Service and other trained experts. So just in general, we got feedback that this is a tool that should be used, can be used, but there are definitely some forest fire, as far as staffing, funding, just all their abilities to deploy fire sometimes is not as effective as it can be. So we just wanted to kind of stress the value of making this more available, that this is a really important tool. Anything to add, guys? Nope. Okay. Moving on. Number 12, not a whole lot changed here. We did say, if you see in blue there, efforts to address invasives must address insects, animals, plants, pathogens, and microorganisms. So originally we just said invasive species. So we kind of expanded on that we're talking about more than just maybe first comes to mind, maybe an invasive plant. We just wanted to kind of expand on that we could be talking about spotted lanternfly or emerald ash borer as much as Japanese barberry. So the other thing is kind of the approach. So we mentioned it above. I'll read it. One approach is to reconvene the New Jersey Invasive Species Council, created in 2004, but currently dormant, and charge them with updating and implementing a statewide strategic plan to address the issue with non-native invasive species. Okay. Number 13. So this is about reducing deer densities. We tried to get a little bit more specific. So we've changed our language slightly here. It says the New Jersey DEP should be directed to identify and implement steps to measure and reduce deer densities in our public forest lands to ecologically sustainable levels to enable our forests to regenerate. So we got a little bit more specific there, directing DEP to kind of take action. Okay. And finally, I believe this is our last point. It is. So this one is about funding and staff at DEP. So we tried to flesh this out a little bit more. We obviously had
already reviewed some proposals related to funding. And then we got further comments. So now it's going to read, increased funding and staff to New Jersey DEP is necessary to carry out these activities and address these goals, which is what we said before. The addition is this: funding can include increased funding through the annual budget, new state funding sources such as those identified in task force proposals, external grant programs and other government entities, such as funding through the Inflation Reduction Act, that can assist the agency in completing these goals. So, and these goals would be everything we've been talking about in this framework. Anything to add?
No, other than those asterisks that we mentioned earlier are below that. So what they do is they define the Science Advisory Panel and Oversight Councils, the state climate goals, what we're referring to when we say that, and what we mean by low intensity recreation. All right. I think we're moving on now to clarifying questions. And I think Anjali is going to facilitate that again. So raise your hand if you have a clarifying question. We're not taking comments, but they're clarifying questions at this time. And if you're bashful about raising your hand, you can send a question to Allison in the chat. So Anjali.
Thank you, Eileen. I wonder, okay, so we're gonna take the questions, still sharing the document. I think that would be easier. So first person is Douglas. Douglas, you can unmute now.
Yes, I have a clarifying question, I believe, but you were saying mountain biking would not be allowed. It's currently allowed in lots of, if not all of the state lands, and the mountain biking clubs like Jorb and other places, other clubs do a substantial amount of trail maintenance for the state. I'm not currently a member. I've been a member in the past and I've biked there. And it is a relatively low intensity activity. You don't need to cut trees or anything like that. So I don't know if you ran into some yahoos or something, but I would highly oppose taking mountain biking off. And I think that's just a mistake. I think you can police people to proper behavior, but just not allowing any mountain biking. Certain trails are not appropriate. I agree with that. But saying they're not allowed in any trails, I just think is just wacky. It's just a bad idea. So
thanks, Douglas. Allison, do you mind scrolling back up to that bullet? Because I want to read the exact language.
I mean, you said mountain biking was allowed, but that's not.
Yeah, it was just the example. So
it's actually the definition, Anjali, I think, where we were is maybe where that's addressed, because that's where we define low impact.
I know, but I wanted to read the bullet.
Okay.
Thanks. I just wanted to read it one more time. So New Jersey's public forest land must be protected and managed to maintain and enhance carbon sequestration and storage as necessary to meet the state climate goals while meeting equally important goals of ecological health, biological diversity, climate resiliency, and protection of water and soil resources while providing low intensity. I don't think bullet number 8, Douglas, is saying we far outright ban mountain biking in the state of New Jersey. I think
but that's what you said. You said they weren't going to allow mountain.
Well, it's the goals while maintaining these goals. You know what I mean? It's not. It's our definition, but we can look into it. That's.
And I don't, if we go back to the definition, it also doesn't, I don't think it excludes mountain biking. So
It does not.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Douglas, for flagging that. Okay, Kristen, you are next. Oh, sorry, I just muted you. Apologize. You can go ahead again.
Hi, thanks. Hey, I have a question about the invasive species organization or the invasive organization, isn't what we're doing here kind of coming up with legislation? Can't we've had several invasive experts with phenomenal ideas on how to mitigate this problem who are on this panel. Can't we come up with the legislation and present that with this document? Do we have to have a whole nother, my concern about this is having a whole nother section of the government that's defunct right now, then we have to reenact this organization, and it could be 7 to 20 years before anybody gets around to the invasives, and by that time it's done, we're dead. So I just wonder why we can't come up with our own ideas of legislation to present, or is that not possible?
Well, I mean, we're certainly going, this is the right, like how we call it, the skeleton, the overarching framework that we are recommending to the legislature. It doesn't mean that we're not going to go a little bit more into detail with invasives, for example, or fire, for example. We would consider more proposals as we receive many proposals within, that topic. So it doesn't mean that this is the end of it all, Kristen. But if my co-chairs have anything else to add to this, please.
Just as you noted, Anjali, we're hopeful that if we can wrap up this framework, if we can get broad agreement on this framework, that we would have some time to go back and put some meat on the bones around a couple of these issues, drawing upon some of the proposals that we have. And invasives would be an example where I think we have some good proposals, and it would be great to have some time to dig a little deeper on those and see if we could provide some further recommendations.
Right.
Fantastic, you guys. Thanks for taking my question.
Thank you, Kristen. Okay, Sylvia, you're next.
Hi, okay, the first question I have, since you have it up on the slide, is the Science Advisory Panel. Where does the public get involved? Because what I'm seeing here by what you have listed, foresters, ecologists, wildlife biologists, and etc., it seems like that's been the status quo, and I'd like to see, like, how does the public get involved? Have you all thought about that? Because that's a big part. We're talking about public lands management, and I think many of us feel like the public needs to have a say. And so where would that go in your Science Advisory Panel?
So Sylvia, that the Science Advisory Panel is a panel of experts, but robust public participation is part of all of our bullets for rulemaking, for inventory, for planning.
Okay, so unfortunately, that's sort of been where we're stuck at now, and that's been the status quo. So I encourage that some language be put in here, that actually explicitly says, we're supposed to be talking about public lands. These are stakeholder lands. Many times they're green acre lands that have been encumbered by the state to manage them. But we, the citizens of New Jersey, really need to have more say in how our public lands are being managed. And a lot of what I'm seeing today, unfortunately, it seems like it's keeping the status quo, and that's not what we would hope. And so when I look at not only what you have in front of me, if we could look at number 10, and where you say sound science, where the document is stating sound science, can we all agree that it should be peer-reviewed science? Because what one group's opinion of science might differ from another opinion's, quote, sound science. And so I think as we look at how our public lands should be managed, if we could really look at the peer-reviewed science, which was in many of the proposals that were brought forward that none of us got to hear about. So I'd like to encourage peer-review science and not just the verbs, sound, or the word sound science. And then for number 4, shouldn't we protect all of our public lands? There was a comment about looking at maybe following the national guidelines, which is 30%. But since we're in the most densely populated state of the country, I think 30%, I think most of us agree, where's the water resource value in here? you know, how are we going to protect our climate and our water? If we're looking at putting this bare minimum of 30%, we only have 1 million acres of public lands in the state. So wouldn't it make sense to protect our 1 million acres of public lands?
So Sylvia, I would like to address some of your questions. I'm going to try to remember all of them.
Okay.
Going back up to the first couple of bullets, you know, there's a scientific advisory council, and we encourage, I think we continue to say robust public participation in all steps of the process. So a scientific panel of experts can provide recommendations, but that doesn't mean that that is the end of it all. There's going to be public participation regarding that, you know, throughout the entire process for inventory planning and rulemaking.
And
So
then
I don't think the public can go into the scientific advisory council and debate on the science with what we've described at this council. But certainly the public has all the right, 100% of the right to provide feedback to whatever recommendations this scientific advisory council would deliver, for example, would recommend.
okay, but then there needs to be a mechanism where the public, since these are public lands and the public, just for background, right now that's being ignored. You know, it's being said there's robust public feedback, but I will tell you right now that's being ignored. And so since we're trying to improve on things, we have to protect the public's interest in this. So is there a way that we could add something to this framework? Because I'll be honest, I'm not comfortable with this as it's written for those
Can
reasons.
I respond to that, Anjali? Because
Yeah, please, Tom.
there's one thing I want to point out, which has been added and which is different and is not status quo,
Okay,
which is the rulemaking process to govern how forest management plans are reviewed, right?
mhm,
Under the Administrative Procedures Act. That's different than current. Currently, there is the 14-step process, which is an internal process at the DEP, which does include provisions for public input. But when you adopt something through rulemaking under the Administrative Procedures Act, there is a higher bar there in terms of how an agency must consider public input in a rulemaking process, and they have to show all of the input that is received by the public. They have to respond, right, to all issues raised by the public, right? And there are even, you know, there are appeal mechanisms there that don't necessarily exist, you know, through a current internal process. So there is a higher bar being set there in terms of the requirement for and the requirement to take and also consider and show that the agency has considered public input by putting that, you know, into a rulemaking process. So that is a change versus the status quo that I think strengthens the voice, you know, the voice of the public in terms of how these plans are reviewed.
Right. In addition to the public participation with the plans, right? That's the big overarching rulemaking, but it doesn't stop there. And we add it throughout the entire framework.
Right. And if I could also just respond to one other point. Again, we're not saying it should be 30% of public lands. We're saying that should come out of the planning process. But we're referencing that, you know, among other things, this national initiative should be considered. And I also wouldn't characterize it as, well, if it's not designated as a set aside, it's not, you know, it's not protected, right? It's sort of, we're talking about levels of protection and oversight.
Right.
The set asides would have additional layers of protection and oversight, similar to natural areas. But then management outside of set asides, you know, is governed by, you know, by other provisions here. It's governed by the planning process. It's governed by, you know, the more stringent comprehensive rulemaking that's put in place that will, you know, govern how management plans you know, are developed and approved. So it's not simply a matter of protected and unprotected. It's about sort of layers or sort of or levels, you know, levels of protection.
Right.
And where's the water protection? Is that just something that gets into the rulemaking process? I guess,
It's an ecological goal, Sylvia, water quality, and it is mentioned.
Yeah, it's mentioned right there, and
Sure.
well, I guess it would be, it's mentioned in the goals, the overall goals for management and protection of public forests, which is further down, right? And when we list
Bullet
the
number
goals,
8. I think it's bullet
okay,
number
number
8.
8.
water resources are specifically singled out in that bullet, and you know, would also clearly be a part of the planning process, because the planning process is geared to address all of those goals, right? Climate and carbon, but also ecological health, biological diversity, resiliency, protection of water and soil resources, et cetera, is all part of, you know, clearly identified as priority goals, and then would be part of the, you know, part of the planning and inventory process as well.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Rich, you are up next. You're on mute, Rich, but you can unmute yourself. Well, let me try again.
Yeah, no, we're good. Thank
Okay.
you. First, let me just express my thanks to the co-chairs for all your work on the framework. So thank you for that. I'm not sure if you get that many thank yous, but let me be on the record of saying thank you. Next, based on the Attorney General's lawsuit this morning or at 12 noon at Liberty State Park, could a possible source of funding be state lawsuits against fossil fuel polluters causing climate change?
That's a great idea, Rich. Although this lawsuit might take many,
Oh,
many.
yes, yes, exactly. But it's just another potential source of funding down the road.
Definitely.
And
yeah.
so, and then finally, at this point, maybe I should have asked this months ago, but the definition, I'm glad you have definitions, but there's no definition of a forest. United Nations has a definition of a forest, and, you know, talking about 0.5 hectares of trees with higher than 5 meters and so forth. But would it be a reasonable thing to have a definition of a forest somewhere in here or not? And that would be it.
Thank you, Rich. I'm gonna pass this to my co-chairs because I don't have the answer for that.
Oh, we absolutely can.
All right,
Thank
let
you.
me, okay, well, thank you. All right, bye.
Okay, Elliot, you're next. Thank you, Rich.
Understanding that the 30% goal of natural areas and ecological reserves is just a reference until the planning process gives a better number. I'm wondering, why wouldn't it be more appropriate to define the criteria of what would qualify as a natural area or an ecological reserve, and then any land, any forest that meets that criteria becomes a natural area or ecological reserve, rather than arbitrarily coming up with a percentage.
So I think, Elliot, I think that is part of the process of rulemaking, which is understanding what is the criteria for a set aside? What is the criteria for a land that needs to be further managed for whatever reason it is? I think that is going to be developed in the rulemaking of how we're going to categorize each, you know, part of the forest in New Jersey, and also how should we manage that. Co-chairs, correct me if I'm wrong. And, you know, that's the whole thing of like the Scientific Advisory Council, but then also robust public input so that everybody gets to participate in deciding what is the specific criteria for what you want to consider a set aside or a reserve.
Yeah, that I think is satisfactory, that it is based on criteria rather than an artificial or arbitrary policy number.
Right. This is just an initiative that we're
Yeah.
suggesting that, you know, should be considered because it's a pretty ambitious initiative on a national scale. So this is just for reference.
Yeah, and I would just add a little bit to that if I could. I mean, because I hear your concern, Elliot. The flip side is, if we don't put anything out there, people might interpret this notion of set asides very differently, right? So right now, I think there's about 40,000 acres of natural areas in the state, right? Which is a very small percentage. So I guess, we were trying to create a sense without saying it should be 30%, right? We were trying to create a sense that, we're suggesting that there be set asides on a significant scale, right? Not like going from 40,000 to 80,000 acres, right?
Right.
So that's kind of the idea behind this. There may be different ways of getting at that, but we want to say two things. One, that it should be based on planning and science and what are the objectives we're trying to accomplish. And two, it should be at a significant scale, right? I mean, that's kind of what we're trying to convey here.
Mhm.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Elliot. Joseph, you're next.
Thanks, Anjali. Hey guys, what in this explicitly would prevent a significant increase in tree removal from state-owned forests?
What from the framework would prevent significant tree removal? Current in New Jersey. That's the question.
Yeah.
Joe?
Yeah, what would prevent a significant increase in tree removal from state forests?
Right. I mean, my answer to that, Joe, would be, first of all, for people to understand that right now there's really nothing in place that would prevent significant tree removal on state forest lands outside of natural areas, which again, I think I noted are 40,000 acres, and I'm not entirely sure whether all 40,000 acres are on state lands. But outside of a very small percentage of state lands, there's really nothing to prevent large scale removal
Mhm.
of clearing of forests.
Well,
Not
yes,
that
there is, Tom, there's gridlock. That's what's preventing it right now. So with this new regime, which opens everything up, what would explicitly prevent it, a real world increase in wood removal?
I guess I wouldn't interpret it as, I don't view it as opening things up, Joe. I mean, if we had expanded set asides in some form, whether that's natural areas or ecological reserves, those are going to be areas that are, if anything, sort of less likely to see extensive management. I mean, we talk about, we define those as about, the goal being maturing forests and providing for future old growth and management only as necessary to deal with ecological threats. So to me, that's not opening things up. That's providing additional layers of protection for some, significant portion of our public lands. And then there would be added layers of oversight even outside of those areas through this rulemaking process.
Mhm.
Right. So right now that doesn't exist. Right now there's the 14-step process with an internal process. But we're talking about adding a formal rulemaking that would govern how any forest management plans on public lands must be, completed and approved with public input. So to me, that's not opening things up. That's adding processes right now that don't exist right now. So again, the current situation is that there's very little in place outside of natural areas that would preclude extensive harvesting on our public lands. Not that that's happening on an extensive basis right now. And what we're recommending are things that aren't currently in place, right? Set asides and more clear formal processes governing how forest management plans are developed and approved, neither of which are in place right now.
Yeah, I think it sounds like the opposite's going to happen. The lumber removal, people have been very happy and quiet, and this seems like you could preserve 30% in natural areas, but you still have 70% where there's nothing explicit preventing a significant increase in wood removal. So that wasn't a clarifying question, that last part. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Leslie, you're next.
Thank you. I basically have two questions, but I would like to clarify. The Biden administration's goal is 30% of the total area, not 30% of your natural areas. So we have 20% of New Jersey's forests protected, 20% of our land area in protected forests. So we still haven't met the 30% goal, and I think we're working hard to increase it. My two questions relate to number 4. I concur with your description, Tom, of your goals in 3, which is these areas that are treated as natural areas, and that, the ways in which they should be protected. But what I don't understand is when you go to the next designation, 5, what is different about number 5? What active management to address current and future threats to ecological health would make these areas different from the other natural areas? You seem to want management for ecological restoration. I wouldn't use the word health myself. I don't think you're clear in your document here yet about that. But what's the difference? What can I not do in area 4 that I can do in area 5?
I mean, I think one answer to that is we're defining a primary objective of area 4 to provide for maturing forests and future old growth forests.
So what's the difference with number 5? Why wouldn't we have, what are you going to do in number 5? Are you going to log forest in number 5? What's the difference?
Well, there's a whole set of other goals that are identified, right? I mean, go back.
What do those goals want you to do that you can't do in number 4?
Well, I think in some cases there may be more active management necessary to address some of those goals.
Do you mean logging when you say active management?
I don't think logging is the only activity aside from having a reserve, Leslie.
That would be the only additional activity in these other things that aren't the set-asides.
Well, thank you for.
Is that true? I'm just trying to clarify it. Because I do think we could, as a group, possibly agree that we should have no expansion of logging on public land, given the climate crisis. And I think we also can look at issues that have been raised by quite a number of people about, like, no heavy equipment, no exemptions from permitting regulations, protection of large trees. It's just not clear that the large trees are protected. And I think that's an important thing that people want to know about. It was heavily emphasized in the discussions, and 2/3 of the proposals about forest emphasize that. So I'd like to know, so the set-asides just allow log, and why? What do we gain in our climate goals or in our ecological goals by adding areas with logging? That's what I want to know. I could hear Kristen talking about early successional habitat.
Leslie, these are clarifying questions, and where this discussion is headed is right now to the same discussion that we've been having over and over and over many times before. So I want to keep the clarifying questions going. So if you don't have
the difference, it's logging.
Okay, that's your opinion.
Well, no, what else is? Tell me. I'm asking, this is a question.
Okay. Leslie, there's
allowed.
other objectives, there's other tools.
What
Now,
tools?
for instance, using pesticides on invasive species, there's a wealth of objectives.
What does
that you can have.
ecological restoration say?
Leslie, I'm
about
trying to
invasive?
answer your question, and then we're done. So there
What
are other
have we done
goals
it
that you can
for?
have for an area and other tools that may be used to accomplish those goals. That's the answer to that question. We're going to the next question. Thank you.
I mean, I would offer one perspective, Eileen. I mean, certainly when you think about the pinelands, right? Like, there's a different set of management approaches that are necessary in the pinelands that oftentimes, if you said we're going to manage the pinelands to prioritize carbon, right? Then you wouldn't in some cases, you might not do thinning, or you might not do prescribed burn, because you're doing things that in the short run are negative from a carbon standpoint, and you're doing it because you're trying to prevent the risk of catastrophic wildfire,
Not
or
prescribed burn, come on.
or you're trying to maintain, the Pine Barrens ecosystem. And if we just if we manage that landscape purely to like maximize carbon, right, that would lead to a different set of approaches. So
You are interpreting purely, your number 4 includes ecological restoration management. So do I, that's all. And that includes potential use of herbicides. It includes prescribed
Okay.
burn.
Okay,
Moving on, guys,
Yes.
moving on. Come on.
thank you, Leslie. Kristen, you're next.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. So I think the biggest thing that jumped out to me was in number 3, the new number 3, where it talks about that no newly initiated plans will be approved during this 1-year time frame, right? So I think from a land manager perspective, and for those of us who are involved deeply in land management, right, like that planning process at times can take a year or more to happen. And so I'm curious as to, what that actually looks like, that no newly initiated plans will be approved during this 1-year time frame. And, because I will say that when I read this, right, I'm looking at it from a perspective where it seems like there's additional checks and balances. So I disagree with some of the previous comments that talk about that this seems like it's opening up the floodgates. From a land manager's point of view, it seems like it is adding even more checks and balances. So I'm just curious if you can clarify that moratorium.
Yeah, I'm gonna start with this, Kristen. So essentially within that first year that the DEP is developing this rulemaking process with the starting point of the 14 steps, it's sort of like, so we don't continue the status quo of no like actual regulation that can inform the adoption of a plan, for example. So that's why there's this 12-month period where we're saying, okay, while DEP is developing this rulemaking, we're not going to, new plans won't be, permitted, for example, but existing plans can continue, right? It's not like the entire operation is shutting down. But as then the 14-step rule comes into place, right? It's that now there is a process in rule language that the population of New Jersey can follow. Then those plans that have been on the planning side of things but have not yet been approved can be subject to that in rule language, and then be approved if it makes sense according to that new rulemaking. I don't know if I think I answered your question.
Okay, so I just want to yeah, thanks for that. To just clarify, right? So that would mean that if it's that if it is existing plans that have been approved, that those can continue, correct? That's
right. Yeah, they've been approved. They can continue.
Okay, and then so for say plans that have been submitted, and maybe they've been waiting to be approved, would those be ones that would then just have to continue to wait?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say, Anjali, I think that's not I wouldn't be a decisive black and white no on that. Like if there's a plan like that's been in review back and forth, et cetera, we made that comment, no newly initiated plans.
Oh, that's right. Thank
So I
you.
do think there's an allowance for circumstances like that. Yeah, I don't think we can just shut those down,
Okay, yeah,
Thank
so
you.
so
Yeah.
so if like, January 1, if this goes into effect, any plans that have been submitted for approval before that could potentially move forward depending on a couple things, but then just everything after that date would be subject to this. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Andy. Thank you, Kristen. Okay, Brian, you're next.
Good afternoon. Just, a little bit of helping to clarify how these goals will mesh with at times contradictory goals and limitations, quite frankly, for example, require timber harvest or were required specifically for wildlife management. How can we clarify how these goals will, either supersede those original restrictions on the land or be compatible with them? There's what, 800,000 acres, over 800,000 acres right now that's managed by the New Jersey Forest Service. And again, some of those lands were acquired specifically for timber management. Some of these goals would be entirely contrary to those original goals and purposes of the state acquiring those lands.
So Brian, if I understood your question correctly, is what happens if the new inventory and planning is in opposition or it's different from the previous goals of specific portions of land?
Or specifically the conditions for which the state acquired the lands.
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. I think my understanding, and please, Andy, Tom, Eileen, jump in if I'm saying something crazy. My understanding is, the new inventory of all lands would really inform the conditions of our forests currently. And so currently that would then inform the planning and, what to set aside, what to preserve here in New Jersey. So I think in my understanding, if things have changed and it makes more sense for a different type of management or very little management, that would then change based on the conditions, the current conditions of our forests. But the internal conflicts of how the state acquired the land, that's just something that probably needs to be worked out through the process. Eileen, Tom, Andy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we would have to look at the original goals and if they are in fact contradictory with what the new inventory and planning process lays out. That's a good point.
But Eileen, do you mean we asking like us, or is this, scientific advisory panel?
No, I meant we as a society,
As in
yeah, not us.
the public
Yeah,
participation is not, it's
Yes,
not
the
town.
whole thing.
Yes. Okay.
I guess my vision of this is that that's why there's the initial rulemaking, because we recognize something needs to happen right away while this more comprehensive process unfolds, right?
Right.
So there's the initial rulemaking within the first year that's largely based on the 14-step process with any modifications that are needed. And then there's a more comprehensive rulemaking that follows that's, informed by what comes out of the inventory and planning process, and then probably ultimately supersedes, right? Like encompasses and supersedes the initial rulemaking. So,
my feeling is that there is, conditions embedded in the legislative actions that enabled acquisitions of large portions of our state forest that specifically mention or require or incorporate timber harvest as one of the uses for our state forests. And timber harvest, the economic benefits, the economic impact of timber management is entirely excluded from this. I think we'll run into problems implementing this if we ignore that in the planning process.
I guess my response to that, I don't think what we have here precludes timber management, right? I mean, but it does, I think the purposes for managing our public forests does not include, and this is intentional, to manage, our public forest lands for forest products. That's not included in the list of purposes.
That's exactly my point, in that many of our forest lands were acquired or obtained by the legislature specifically for that, and their purposes specifically included timber management.
But timber management for commercial purposes, that's different from timber management.
I would have to read the specific enabling legislation, but for 150 years, we've been managing our state forest for commercial timber production. And there's a reason for that. I'm guessing there's a reason for that. And it's not because the state is looking to make money on it. It's because it's the reason the state acquired those particular forest areas. And to ignore it at this level, I think we set ourselves up for long-term failure.
Understood. Well, I guess I would just clarify, and my co-chairs tell me if you see this differently, that where the four co-chairs are on this issue is we have not defined commercial timber harvesting as a purpose, a management objective for New Jersey's public forest lands. But we are acknowledging that to meet certain management objectives in some locations based upon, sound science, planning and inventory with public oversight, that active management, timber management is an appropriate tool to meet certain objectives. But the objectives do not include providing commercial forest products as the framework stands now. But my fellow co-chairs tell me if you would modify it any way what I just said.
That's correct, Tom.
Yeah, I agree, Tom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're not precluding timber harvesting, but like you said, Tom, the primary goal of commercial timber harvesting is not on our list as a primary goal.
Again, nowhere in here is there mentioned timber harvest. I didn't see the word timber harvest anywhere in any of this. Yet it is one of the specific goals included in the legislation that was used to obtain our state forests.
It's Brian, it's a great point. We see it as a tool. Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, Eileen, Tom. We see it as a tool, not necessarily a goal.
Yeah, Brian, I don't see it in the forest action plan. Where might we find language?
The legislative actions that were taken to acquire the state forest from the beginning.
Okay.
All right, well,
have to
we'll need to look
up.
at that. I
Yeah,
think
we'll look it up.
we need
Yep.
to see that information and better understand that.
Yes, thank you.
Understand, I have no economic interest in timber harvest on state lands, but again, the reason a lot of our state forests were acquired by the state was specifically for timber production and the economic activity that it supports.
Okay.
It could be that it's changed over time, also. So, but we'll look that up.
Yep.
We'll look it up.
Thank you, Brian. All right, Ken, you're next.
Thank you. So back to, I guess, bullets 3, not bullets, but, points 3 and 4. I've never seen this 14-step stakeholder process. So could we all get a copy of it? I can't vote on something that I've never seen. My gut tells me if that's the process that's being used to give us the situation we have right now, that it's not based on science, and I would have to vote against it. So before we're asked to vote on something like that, it would be helpful if we could see it. My second question has to again come back to, I guess, was Kristen's point about the issue of no newly initiated plans will be approved. Or actually, let me start with the separate rulemaking process. So are we talking about having legislation passed that would state specific policies upon which rulemaking would be made? Or are we just basically saying, which I understand now to be the case, that under Title 13, the DEP was asked or told to create rules for management of public lands, public forests, and they never did. And so therefore, there's no reason to say that they have to wait for legislation. And so are you talking about, having them start right now? Or do you need legislation? And if it's legislation involved, and that could take a year or more, would that also then, during that process, prevent any new plans from being approved?
So Ken, I think you have many questions here and I'm confused. Tom, did you get the questions?
I would just say, again, like the purpose of this task force was established by the legislature to make recommendations to the legislature.
Right.
So I understand your point. I think the best we can do is recommend to the legislature what we think should happen, which then is going to require legislative action. Yes. So
Yeah, okay, so you're saying, so this thing about, a year for rulemaking, while it may take a year or more, DEP is not known for ever doing anything early, that this could be years in the process. It might take a couple of years to get legislation passed, then another year or more for the rulemaking process to take place. I mean,
it
right?
could, or it
years.
could happen quickly. I mean, this is a high priority for Senator Smith. He's waiting. He's asked for a report by the end of the year. Several of us have seen and heard the senator speak recently where he talks about this being a high priority for him. And so I think if we have a strong report and there's a lot of support across different sectors that hasn't been there on these issues, right? And I'm optimistic that we could get legislative action on this in relatively short order.
Yeah.
Well, I guess then my question kind of boils down to, why doesn't the no newly initiated plans starting point start with the submission of the report from this task force?
Because
why doesn't it start at that point?
Ken, because we don't have that authority. We're recommending to the.
Well, you can recommend it.
We can recommend for them, to pass legislation. Essentially, the recommendation is use this 14-step process as a starting point, right? We're not telling the legislature to tell the DEP to just take that 14-step process and just put it into rule. And then, once the legislature makes that recommendation, then it's in statute, therefore it immediately would go into no newly initiated plans shall be approved.
Yeah, but I'm saying that could take years. Why not at least come out of the task force with a recommendation that says no new plans until this whole process of legislation and rulemaking has been completed?
The only person that can do this is the governor, not the
I
legislature.
said a recommendation from the task force.
I'll just weigh in. We could make that recommendation, but we feel we would not get consensus.
Yeah.
There are several people on this task force who agree with you. Ken.
Well,
I really don't think that you do not represent the whole of the task force.
Okay, but
So
there's points.
you saw what we are recommending. That's what we are recommending. And unless my co-chairs are, I'm not.
We are recommending what you're saying, Ken. We're saying we believe there should be no new plans. The question is,
when does it start?
There's only the only way to effectuate that. It's how to effectuate that is the question, right? So again,
but I'm not going to vote for this. I'm not going to consent to this because I think, you could do a much better job of this. So I'm not going to agree to.
Okay, that's fine. This is not what this is
consensus
about
on
right
this.
now. This is about clarifying questions. So
Well, you brought up the reason for not doing something as being something that you didn't think you'd get consensus on. So I'm explaining why you wouldn't get consensus on this.
Right. Okay.
Thank you, Ken. We only have a few minutes left. We really want to keep it to 5:30. So if we can really move things along because we have other parts of the agenda to get to. So Margaret, I ask you to please keep it speedy.
Okay, so it's going back to question number 4 and the 30% number. That's 30% of the land base to promote maturing forests. That's 30% of the entire state of New Jersey, which is 5 million acres. Right now, 2 million acres are developed, 1 million are protected. 30% would be 1.5 million. The 1 million that's protected includes farmland, so it's not all forested. The forested is only half of that. So right now, only 10% of state forest land is available for this 30% number you're trying to reach. The entire forest land that belongs to the state is only 10%. You would have to triple that to reach this 30% number. You would have to take all that protected farmland and convert it to forest, and that would get you to 20%. And then you'd still need another 10% more. So I really think you guys don't realize how far behind you are on this. And then let's talk about the loggers. I did some research
Margaret,
of my own.
Clarifying questions.
Okay, the question is, since logging, we only have 400 loggers in New Jersey compared to 900,000 small businesses. So they are only 0.04% of the businesses, and 75% of that is done on private land. So only 0.01% is done in the public forests. So it's such a small piece of New Jersey's economy. Why are we bending over backwards to allow them to dominate control of the forest, which affects all of us? It affects 100% of us. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Sarah, you're up next.
Yes, thank you. So I just have a couple comments and questions. I'm confused because the reason Senator Smith set up this task force was to make changes to give us better climate defense and better management of our forests. And I believe New Jersey wants to see the kind of set aside idea applied to nearly all of our natural lands. I'm pretty sure about that. And certainly on our task force, we're striving, and I think we strive for 100% consensus, which is just only going to result in no major changes because we'll get the status quo. So I don't understand why we haven't got in this plan, in this set of, maybe you can explain to me why there is nothing here to reduce the amount of logging on our public lands or harvest or whatever you want to call it, and why we are not trying to work toward what Senator Smith requested, which is better defense against climate change. And that is done by preserving our intact, mature forest lands as forests and not managing them as they are being managed now. So I don't understand why we've moved away so far from that. I hear you saying you don't think you can make some recommendations, but that's really what the task force is supposed to be doing.
Sarah, I just want to clarify that, again, the charge by Senator Smith is not just climate change. We keep clarifying this in every single meeting. There's other things about the forest, not just carbon sequestration and storage. Additionally, the set-asides, that's something that is not part of the status quo. This is us saying that whatever piece of forest in New Jersey has older trees, however they are categorized right now, that have the potential to become old growth, that those portions of forest should be categorized as reserves and set-asides and should be protected through the natural areas program or through the other program of like set-asides. That's essentially everything that you just said is essentially what we're trying to achieve. Co-chair, please, if you want to add anything else.
I agree. I would just say, I think people are ignoring, we are recommending exactly that, creating set-asides to protect maturing forests, to provide for future old growth forests, for their carbon and other benefits. That's exactly what people have been recommending. Now, people are going to argue about how much should that be, right? And some people are going to say that should be 100%. And others are going to say it shouldn't be 100% because we have other objectives that we need to also address on our public forest lands that require different approaches than and making the entirety of it as set-asides. That's the debate. But just acknowledge that that recommendation is in there, right? That speaks directly to what I think we've heard that people want. They want to protect maturing forests, old growth forests for their carbon benefits, and that's exactly what we're recommending.
If I might just follow up, I understand that, but it's a very small nod toward that compared to the major shift that I think for ecological integrity as well as for climate that we want. I don't think that the language that you have come up with is very compelling about that being a default major approach to our conservation lands, which is what the people on this task force would vote for were they given the chance to, I believe. So I don't think it's strongly worded enough to really represent a major change. And so I'd suggest thinking about that if you're going to make changes.
Thank you, Sarah. I just also want to add the point that, you know, all of the language that we've modified is in response to all of the feedback that we received from everybody in this task force for each individual bullet point, right? So we are reflecting what this task force would like to see. But thank you, Sarah. I think Kristen, no, wait, sorry, I'm skipping people. It's 5:30, co-chairs, like, do we take a couple of questions more, or do we just move it along because we're running out
I
of time?
just have a quick question, actually.
Okay, Stephen. Was that
Um,
you, Stephen?
Yes.
Okay, and then,
Um,
so I'm gonna end it, let's just do it this way. Douglas, is that a legacy hand, Douglas, by any chance?
No, that's actually Susan. We're on the same.
All right,
yeah.
so Susan, you're gonna be the last ones, and everybody, if you can just keep it really fast, please, clarifying questions.
Lightning round, real quick.
Lightning round, exactly. Stephen, you're up next.
Is this framework meant to supplant the proposals that were made, the 80-something proposals? Or is the framework meant to be an umbrella and then we do the proposals underneath them?
Correct, that is correct. It's the
last part.
umbrella. It's the umbrella, it's the skeleton. If time permits, that's the whole concept. We're trying to, be done with the framework, achieve
The re-
consensus on the framework, and then using that time that we have left for the rest of the year to continue going into proposals.
One of the reasons why I asked that question is because some of our proposals can actually embed some of the more specific issues that some people have been bringing up for clarification, like provide definitions, et cetera.
Right,
So
exactly.
we can do that actually in the proposals. So the framework just has to be broad enough that we can fit everything that we want to have underneath it.
Thank you, Stephen. That's exactly right. Okay, John, go ahead.
Yes, following up on Brian Kirkpatrick's questions, I'd like to clarify that the inventory, the planning and inventory effort being made here, that the very first step will be identifying the purpose for which each individual state-owned forest land was acquired. It's all documented. It should be the very first thing done. And if it says it was acquired to manage forest for logging, so be it. But if it doesn't, then I think we have to start asking some questions like, why did we acquire these? And when you get into areas like the Green Acres program, we only acquire these properties for recreation and conservation purposes. And frankly, conservation purposes was never defined in any regulation in the state of New Jersey. So one of the things we should be asking the legislature to do is to define what it means by conservation purposes.
Thank you, John. Okay, Nick, lightning round. Wait, you can unmute yourself now, Nick. Try. There you go.
I'd like to read something here. Can you hear me?
Nick, we really have to be quick.
Questions?
Yes, it's very short. And the logging that took place on Sparta Mountain took place. Yes.
We're not going to talk about Sparta Mountain. We're talking about the framework. Just clarifying questions, please.
I have a framework right here. And first of all, are natural areas meant to offset somehow forested areas, mature, or whatever? There are no old growth forests. Here, real quick. The Highlands Department anticipates that the regional master plan will address the components necessary to protect the natural, scenic, and other Highlands resources, included but not limited to forest, wetlands, stream corridors, steep slopes, and critical habitat for fauna and flora. NJSA 1320-11. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Douglas, you're the last one. Please go ahead, and Speedy, please.
Yeah, that's me.
I forgot, I'm sorry.
I am by the interim process, what that means, because I don't know what the 14 steps are. But I assume that means that the regulations would be to adopt this 14-step process for any future plans until this comprehensive regulations comes into play. So meanwhile, the 14 steps is what rules.
Right.
Okay. We would like to know what the 14 steps are. So
yeah,
it's a little confusing the way it's written.
It's starting with the 14 steps, because that's already in place, right? So this is guidance from the DEP. And Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, but this was discussed in the regulatory.
I was going to say, this
subgroup?
was discussed in the regulatory subgroup, so not everyone had the benefit of that, where I think one of the sessions, we kind of went through that in detail. So
Right.
I know not everyone is as familiar with that, but we can certainly share more information with everyone about the 14-step process.
Okay, it is very difficult to get any rulemaking done in a year. So
That's why we suggested to start with that, because it's already in place, right?
Okay, okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, done with clarifying questions.
All right. So we were gonna, and co-chairs correct me, we're gonna do a preliminary poll based on the revisions, comments, and clarifying questions. We wanted to take a pulse of the people in attendance today, because not everybody, on whether you would agree with this revised, with a couple of tweaks, right, Tom? I'm looking at Tom. There were a couple of clarifying tweaks we can make, such as, for instance, maybe attach a copy of the 14-step process, things like that. Would you tend to agree with it, today, or would your tendency be to disagree? Am I stating that correctly, co-chairs? Is that what we wanted to do?
Yeah, this is just, taking the temperature, right? We did the survey, you provided input, we made some changes in response to the input. We want to get a sense of sort of taking the temperature of how people are feeling about this, revised framework. It's not a formal vote. It's taking the temperature of the room.
Yeah, and as we've been emphasizing, the comments that came in from the people who were likely, but they wanted some clarifications, the people who were not likely without some certain revisions. And we took the bulk of those edits and suggestions and put them into the revisions. So it is our hope that we addressed most of those. We know that we did not address all of those. That's what we've just been hearing, but we do hope that we addressed a lot of the others. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll for the entire framework, and then we can, if needed, we can itemize them again and do the planning versus the implementation. So I'm going to go ahead and launch. It's just a simple agree support with the entirety of the framework, or disagree, do not support with the entirety.
Eileen, I'm sorry, can I just ask a quick question? Who is voting right now? Like, is it everybody that's?
It's not a vote, not a formal vote. It's just to get a temperature in the room. Everybody on this, on the Zoom.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody so even like DEP employees are voting, and
DEP has not been participating in surveys. That was just their decision. So DEP employees are not participating.
And co-chairs are also not.
Okay.
Eileen, how do we indicate that we've been moved a lot closer to agreeing, but don't totally agree yet?
What? Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Last time, Eileen, we did agree, or likely to agree, not likely to
do that
agree.
again.
You want to do that again?
Yeah, but let's finish this, because
let's finish this, and then we can parse it out a little finer, John.
Okay.
So please vote on this, or select your answer, and then we'll go finer, as Tom just said.
Yeah, because it does seem like some people are not ready to vote. That's all right too.
We keep saying vote, but it's not a.
I know, I just did it.
Difficult.
It's a poll to get a temperature of the room. Just to add some stuff. We might not ever reach any kind of agreement, and that would be so unfortunate. Just want to throw that out. All right, did everyone who wanted to vote? Oh, I did it again. Everyone who participated. Okay, because I don't see it moving anymore. And here we go. Share results. So it's kind of, I don't want to say even, but it's
No, it's 60-40. So
yeah. So that's on the whole framework. That's actually worse than before.
well, that's because before there was a likely category, and that may be. Let's do it that way.
All right. So let me bring up one of the likelies. I have another poll created, I believe, that has the 4 choices. Here we go. All right, it says generic poll, but it's for the entirety of the framework. Anybody else? It looks like it's, oh, there's another one. All right, so if last chance, I'm going to end it. Oops, there goes another one. All right, here we go, and share. Oh, so this breakdown actually is similar. So I guess we did, I guess the revisions did absolutely nothing.
Thanks, guys.
Is it valuable, do you think, to pin, it was valuable to pinpoint. It did seem like the planning last time, planning and implementation seemed to have less agreement in the first poll that we did. So maybe we'll go ahead and divide these up then. So we'll do a poll based on those first, how many are there? The planning and implementation. Those are bullets 1 through 7. Bullets 1 through 7. Oops, or what we're gonna planning and inventory. I would do the 4.
The last results did come out as 68-32. 68% in favor, 32 either against.
Oh, you mean if you add them up? Yeah,
Yeah.
so very similar to the first one. Okay, so this one I'm going to call.
Well, the first one was 60-40. That's why I was saying.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Planning. Oops. Okay, so planning and implementation, and here we go. So this is bullets 1 through 7, planning and implementation.
It's pretty similar.
All right, I'm waiting for everyone. I don't think everyone can see it live like we can. All right, I'm going to end and share. Okay, so you can see that. All right, we have a pretty consistent 15, 16 people who are disagreeing outright. That's similar to what we saw on the originals. So that's not likely to change. Interesting. All right, so that's planning and implementation. And now we'll do the same thing with the management. If I can find that one. Oops. Oh, stop sharing. And new poll. Oh, I don't have another generic one. I'm going to have to create it. I thought I had a bunch of these. All right, let me do this one. It says planning and inventory. I'm going to change the name. Management. And I just have to add 2 choices because it didn't. Be patient. Likely,
You're patient, Eileen, don't worry.
not likely, and then disagree.
I'm a Mets fan. I'm real patient.
All right, save and launch. This is for the management.
Management plans.
Yeah, I just put management. So it's bullets 8 through 14. 8 through 14. All right, I think, is that everyone? Not everyone is voting in everyone, that's okay. This is really just to get an idea. Okay, oh, share.
Yeah, I was just about to flag that, Eileen, that is a total of 63 people.
Yeah, yeah, and then another one 70.
Okay.
So, well, some people might not have an opinion. So this one, so it's similar, very, very similar to the originals. I'm just gonna make an observation that the revisions didn't really do too much, but we wanted to charge, I think, the co-chairs share this. We'd like to charge the group with, what is it, if you're in the likely category, if you're in the middle, what is it that would bring you to agree? Were we going to open this up, or?
Well, we have,
I think that was the idea, but we're down to about 10 minutes. Though
Yeah.
I still think it would be valuable to utilize these 10 minutes, but we're specifically, I think it would be helpful to emphasize those that are in those likely to agree, even likely not to agree. Like where are there points that you feel like could push us closer to consensus in the framework? Something we missed, something we omitted, something we added. But these are observations that would help move us towards consensus, not take us further away. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah, so in that middle category, I just want, what I want to emphasize is, I want to acknowledge that there are some issues that have not been addressed that people feel strongly about, and they disagree with this, and they will continue to disagree, and that's your right. For the folks in the middle, if there is something that can be realistically, that you think the group can agree with, that's what we want to hear from. Okay. So
Okay.
we have some hands up. I didn't notice. Okay, so
Yeah.
Ken, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I voted no on everything. And the reason I did was because while there are several things where I would vote yes, and several things where I would vote likely, I do not like the idea that this has become a package where you have to vote on all 14 items or all 7 items as one set. You need to break them down, and let's vote on each one of the 14. And then I know I will give you a lot more yeses.
thank you, Ken.
Thanks. Julia?
Yeah, thanks. I believe, well, for me, I have a very hard time doing this without looking at the proposals. I think the proposals will help clarify a lot of things, certainly for me, and I think for a lot of other people. But I also agree with what Ken just said.
Yeah, we hear that, but that's where we started, and we could not get past timber harvest, which is why we went this other route. But we do want to bring the proposals back, and they're up there though. They're all up there.
I recognize that, but I think that we had agreed. I mean, a lot of people put a lot of work into those proposals, and we need to have the discussion about those proposals. I don't think that your 60-40 seems to be the best that you're going to get with the framework right now. And in order to improve it, I think we should have the conversation about the proposals.
Yeah, well, we hope to. We hope to. Okay, Leslie?
Yes. I think if the definitions were clarified, like on 4 and 5, that would help people make a decision. I think addressing or adding issues of the removal of wood products, as well as the use of heavy equipment, would go a long way to getting consensus from people who have been having difficulty with management activities that have been proposed. So I think that would help enormously.
Just one response to that, again, because we've been down at least one of those 2 roads, right? We spent 2 full sessions discussing the issues of removal of products and, harvesting versus not harvesting, removal versus not removal. And at the end of those 2 sessions, there was no consensus. So that's why we moved on.
There was as much consensus as you have now, so I wouldn't ignore it.
I would say there was less.
We had majority.
Close.
We had majority
Not
the
even
other way.
Yeah.
There was
Right.
no majority support for any of the different positions there. There was no majority support.
Because
for
there
any
was no opportunity
There was.
to vote for anything but no management. We wanted to vote for protection of old forests, and that was not an opportunity, and it is still not clear here. That would help get consensus.
Gonna move to Chris Hepburn.
Unmute. Okay, can you hear?
Yes.
Okay. I'm in likely. I mean, I like a lot of it. Separate votes would be easier, but my main thing is all this is going to take time, all this good stuff and scientific committees. And I just don't see why we don't recommend or vote on recommending until the process has gone through the inventories and the scientific committees and the public input, no heavy equipment in our forests. I mean, I think the science is clear on soils and what happens, and you can do a lot of active management. You can go in and thin, go in with chainsaws on your feet. You can take out a lot of little trees. You can girdle big trees. You can do habitat management. And that to me is the safest way to go for our forests. And I would like to vote on that. I would like to recommend that. And then I could feel a little more comfortable about the whole framework.
Kristen Maestro.
Hey everyone, can you hear me? Okay, I switched to my phone. Okay.
Yes.
So not sure how helpful this will be for the co-chairs, but I actually was I appreciated the way that the original framework, so I had voted that that I would agree with the original framework that was presented. And then it's more of the revisions that, that have swayed me. So but I think that it's important, like I'd like to have more opportunity to review each one. And I think it might also be an interesting piece to take a look at each item and see where specifically maybe the consensus can be, instead of looking at the whole framework.
Okay, yeah, I heard that a couple times.
Yep.
Okay, Nick.
Yes, I side with Ken and Leslie, and I still feel that the loggers are trying some minority rule here for consensus. And when Dr. Moore came to this task force, he confronted the task force. Why are you taking trees from public forest? And that is the dilemma here. And it's been going on, and it's just inappropriate for the paradigm that we need at this time. We're addressing climate change, and Senator Smith said himself, and Ken Dolsky in the beginning was reprimanded for mentioning, I don't want to hear the word logging mentioned. So I really don't understand what's going on here. Is it climate change, new science versus climate change deniers? So it's, we should all
Did
be
you
in
have
the
a
same
suggestion?
paradigm.
Okay, so
Climate
I
change.
hear your suggestion. It's similar to Ken's and Leslie's.
Yes,
Okay,
and I
so,
agree with Ken 100%.
yeah, let's move on to Brian.
So, I'll say where you're starting to lose my support on this is where we start to have preconceived notions of the best way to manage our forests before there are any ecological evaluations done, before there are any inventories done, preconceived notions of the best way to achieve those management objectives, specifically saying, you can't bring a commercial logger in to do the work. To me, that just hamstrings ourselves in the long run in terms of being able to implement objectives. So again, where we start having preconceived notions of how to achieve those forest objectives and setting objectives before we figure out, the best way to manage our forests, that's where you start to lose me.
Okay, thank you. Colette?
Yeah, hi. I'd like to thank the task force for all your hard work and in putting together the framework. I generally support it. I voted today on the poll, likely because I didn't have everything in front of me to say for sure I agree. In that way, I agree with Julia. And I also agree with Julia that you are not going to get consensus on this. I have listened and sat in on pretty much every meeting except one. And it's clear to me, you're not going to get consensus on this framework. You're not going to get consensus on logging. And I agree with Julia that we should get on to, that we should move on to discussing the individual proposals. I think 60-40, which is pretty much what you have now on the framework, is good. I think that's something that you can certainly go back to the senator with. I do agree overall that this framework is very good. And, it's a majority. I just don't see why we're continuing to go in circles on issues that there clearly is not going to be consensus on. So I join Julie in the recommendation. Go back to individual proposals. Thank you. And again, thank you for your work. You guys are doing really incredibly hard work.
Okay, thank you, Colette. Lindsay came in.
Hi, let me see if I can get my video on. I would like to see, we've never had any kind of vote about logging, period. And I would like to see a vote on that.
Oh,
I think that could be very interesting, since this is the major issue that we disagree on.
Right. But we
yeah,
did do.
I'll remind people we did a little paper poll like this, and the opponents of any kind of timber harvest were in the minority. So please keep that in mind when you make statements. The task force is numerous. There are numerous people here. What we're trying to do is say, what can we agree on? But we keep bringing this up and we can't get past it. The same thing happened when we did proposals. But
Then I have a suggestion.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How about if we basically say that there's no logging of very big trees that are, and maybe that's something that we would be able to come to consensus on.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, Sylvia?
Yes, just to sort of add on to what has been said. First of all, with regards to preconceived notion, I think we all can agree that really nature doesn't need management. It's people that need management. So let's be aware that Mother Nature has evolved without our hand or heavy hand in it. And what I would like to encourage, I think where we can get consensus, is let's look at those ecological objectives that can be achieved without heavy equipment, without logging the best red oaks, white oaks, and the big trees that are found in our public lands. I think we can get to some consensus if the removal and extraction process is not part of it, because what I'd like to challenge this task force is where in the science, and I'm talking peer-reviewed science, not timber industry science, but where is peer-reviewed science that states that removal of the best trees in a public forest is good for it? It's not good for the water. It's not good for our air. It's not good for the species. It's not good for biodiversity. And even for fire management, I'd encourage this group to look at John Muir Project and Dr. Chad Hansen's work. They've done a lot of work out in California talking about how managed areas actually burn faster and with fire intensity greater. And the major issue that happens with wildfires is drought. It's not the intact forest. So I encourage everybody to get your research right. Don't be fear mongered into creating forestry plans. There's a lot of peer-reviewed science that's out there that we need to have access to. And it's in a lot of those proposals that we haven't really reviewed. So I'd encourage looking at those proposals as well. Thank you.
John Donay?
Yes, I'm not quite there with the task force leaders, but I'm getting there. And I want to thank you all for the good work you're doing. I also want to remind you that your charge is not to reach consensus. Your charge is to report to Senator Smith on those areas where consensus was achieved and also where there was no consensus. So I wouldn't worry too much about the consensus part. I think that's a very important thing to try to achieve, obviously. But if we can't achieve it, we can at least advise Senator Smith where we can't agree.
Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily with you totally on the framework, but I'm definitely with the co-chairs on the effort they're putting in, and I'm sticking with you.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. And what would it take? What would it take to get you there? Where are your hesitations?
Well, my real hesitation is that we haven't really looked. We've tried very hard to look at the regulations and the laws, but the fact is that the laws really aren't clear. The department has not followed the statutes. They have not adopted the rules that they were supposed to, and more than that, the statutes themselves are ambiguous. There is no definition of conservation purposes in any law in the state of New Jersey. And really, I want to know when the taxpayers of New Jersey were voting on funding for Green Acres programs, and I know, that, Tom, that you know a lot about this stuff, did they really think they were voting to harvest and or remove and or sell forest products from the land they bought? So let's let the legislature say it. If they have the guts to say that that's what they intended, let them say it, but they've never said it. And I think the common definition of conservation does not include harvesting of wood products, although I would be the first to admit that if you go to any federal agency, they now agree that harvesting products is good for the public because it provides wood products. I mean, you'll find it out there. But I want, as part of the inventory, that every single individual piece of state-owned land and also county-owned land and municipal lands be part of the inventory to see what's the agreement? What was the purpose for acquiring it? And did it include harvesting and or removal and or sale of timber and wood products? And if it doesn't specifically say so, then it's not permitted.
All right. Well, that's an issue we need to look at because we heard another commenter flag that, but from the other perspective, saying they believe that there is.
Yes, and I definitely want to meet with him because I do know that he is correct in some instances because I have read all of those rules.
Okay. All right. So that's something we definitely need to better understand. Co-chairs, why don't we give Elliot, I guess that's a new hand, give Elliot the last,
Yeah,
and
he's
then
the last one.
can we wrap up?
Yep.
Thanks, guys. I must admit that I am very, very frustrated, and that colors my responses to your surveys. You know, I think most of, if not all of us, are here because we want to find out what is best to manage our forests. I don't understand the value of finding a couple of things that we all have consensus on. When, you know, we have upwards to 100 people devoting an incredible amount of time to this endeavor. I don't think we're going to get anywhere unless we debate the hard issues. And then maybe we can come to an agreement, or maybe we can't, but we won't know until we have an opportunity to debate.
I think we did it already, Elliot. I think we did it. We spent 4 hours debating the harvesting and removal issues. And at the end of that 4 hours, we were no further along than when we began, other than to clarify that there's strong differences of agreement. I mean, I think we did it. I think we know that's a non-consensus item. John, you just said our charge is to identify consensus and non-consensus items. That's a non-consensus item.
Well, it was
after
a
4 hours,
yeah,
4
we have
hours of
majority.
debate,
Well,
it was
what
clear to
happens?
me.
Yeah, what happens though is that we go with majority. We did have majority. We'd like to have consensus. There's a difference between, because there were clear majority positions, and we could go with them, but we're trying to get some consensus issues.
All I'm saying is I think we could continue debating that issue till we're blue in the face, and we're never going to get agreement on it.
Yeah,
So we moved on. We moved on to other issues
Yeah.
because it's a non-consensus item.
Yeah.
No matter how much more time we spend on it, we're going to come back to the same place. This
Yep.
group of people is never going to agree on that.
Mhm.
But I would add that, Tom, that's still good information for Senator Smith.
Mhm. Yep.
And we can and will document that. But my feeling is no matter how much more time we spend on that, we're going to come back to the same place. I don't think it's productive. I think we already know what we need to know. It's a non-consensus item. We'll document we'll document that in the different perspectives.
You know, we have science to bring into this to add to the debate. We can look at the science, and we're just not. I don't think we've spent enough time really coming to the nut of what we need to do to our forests, for our forests, and I think that in the end would be more productive. Some people may have to give up something, some others may not have to give up something, but the science is what will take us there, and we're not looking at that.
All right, so we're going to put our heads together to determine next steps. And then we'll communicate with folks what those next steps are via email. So be on the lookout for that. We thought that we would be, we'd be farther along with the framework tonight than we seem to be. So we need to come together and figure out how to proceed at this time. So we'll be communicating with folks via email.
I would just say that we didn't avoid the logging issue. This framework allows logging. So it's just keeping the status quo going. So that's why it doesn't work.
Hear me by chance? Hello? This is Emil. Anybody can hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I've started some GIS analysis of the different forest types, uplands, wetlands, non-agricultural forests, post-agricultural forests, and I think if we hang some percentages on the kinds of activities that could be done in the different places, I still think we could come to consensus if we were to take the time to actually, think about the different kinds of activities in different kinds of forests and how much we could live with. I think we could. And I'd just like to throw that out there.
I stand with Emil.
I agree. If you limit product removal to a certain trustworthy amount, you can get some people to agree to it. It's not binary, but we're looking at it like it's binary.
So you guys,
thanks.
I just want to understand now, because this is the question we asked. What would it take to move more people into a supportive column? So one idea that's being thrown out here is to place some parameters, right? Some parameters around, what percentage of our land are we talking about that would be potentially open to active management? Is that the idea? I'm not saying I endorse. I just want to know what the idea is. Some limits, some parameters.
Yeah.
Well, you need the inventory. I mean, isn't that why we did the planning and inventory? Is
Right.
to just determine that. We don't
We
know
cannot-
it now, do
We
we?
don't know it, exactly. We cannot guess.
I think Emil was talking about certain types of, or how we would categorize different types of forests or different types of forest communities.
Sure, yes, the inventory.
Right. Well, there's two different approaches, Eileen. There's one, which is you leave it all to the planning process, right? And it's based on the science and the data and, what comes out of that process. And everybody goes into that process and you continue this debate in that process, right? I mean, that's sort of one model, right? Is that we set up a process and then, how much of each and where and what, it gets hashed out in the planning process. That's one way. The other way is that you say there's a planning process, but you try to set some parameters around that, which was kind of, you could set parameters and say, not planning, but not less than, X percent, in set asides, or not more than Y percent in active. I mean, it's possible to have a hybrid where it's a planning process, but you also try to set some parameters around that if that can move people to a comfort level. It is a model.
That's what I'm trying to suggest, that I think we could put some parameters around a planning process that will obviously need to be much more specific, but have some general parameters based on GIS analysis and what we already know from inventory and all the other data that's already out there. That's only an approximation.
Okay, guys.
Well, we're ending the meeting
Yeah.
because people are already 15 minutes beyond. Just check your emails for next steps. Thanks.